April 12th, 1815. The chandeliers of Lady Beatrice Somerset's Mayfair residence blazed with enough candles to rival the stars, their light falling across silks and jewels, across the polished parquet where dancers turned in graceful measures to the strains of a Viennese waltz. The spring air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of hyacinth from the garden below, mixing with expensive perfumes and the warmth of 100 bodies moving through the rhythms of London society at the height of the season. Eleanor Thornhill stood near one of those open windows, positioned as she always was at such gatherings, close enough to the activity to appear present, but far enough removed to remain essentially invisible. A shadow in dove-grey silk among the brilliant plumage of younger, prettier creatures who commanded attention as naturally as flowers turn toward the sun. At 28, she had long since accepted her place in the social order, that peculiar limbo reserved for unmarried women who had aged beyond hope, too old to be considered prospects, too unremarkable to inspire even passing interest, existing primarily as useful companions to married sisters and elderly aunts. She watched the dancers with the careful observation that had become her chief occupation at such events, noting the way Miss Louisa Whitmore's rose silk gown caught the light as she laughed up at her partner, the way Mrs. Charlotte Pembroke's sharp eyes tracked every interaction with the precision of a hunting bird, cataloguing gossip and scandal for later distribution. Eleanor had learned to find a quiet satisfaction in observation, in the intellectual exercise of understanding the complex social machinery that turned so smoothly around her while barely acknowledging her existence. She was useful to Beatrice, her elder sister, who had married well 6 years prior, and now felt obligated to provide Eleanor a home and occasional access to society, useful in the way of someone who could be relied upon to assist with wallflowers and elderly guests, to make up numbers at dinner parties, to listen with genuine interest to the tedious stories of those whom others avoided. Yet even as she accepted this role with outward grace, there existed within her a small, stubborn flame of longing she tried to extinguish but could not quite manage to smother entirely. Tonight it flickered painfully as she overheard 2 young matrons passing near her position by the window, their voices carrying clearly in that particular way that suggested they either did not notice her presence or did not consider it worth moderating their speech. "Poor Eleanor Thornhill," one of them murmured, still attending balls at her age, as though hope itself were not somewhat pathetic in a woman so thoroughly on the shelf. The other replied with false sympathy that at least dear Lady Somerset continued to include her, though really that grey gown did nothing whatsoever to improve matters, making her look rather like a governess who had wandered into the wrong gathering. Eleanor felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, but kept her expression carefully neutral, her gaze fixed on the garden below, where lanterns swayed gently in the mild evening breeze. She had perfected this appearance of serene unconcern, this ability to absorb cruelty without flinching visibly, though each careless word added weight to the conviction that she was exactly what they said, unremarkable, forgettable, unworthy of notice. Across the ballroom, though she did not know it, Thomas Harcourt stood in conversation with a group of gentlemen, his attention apparently on their discussion of hunting and horses. But his eyes had found her there by the window, as they had found her at every gathering these past 3 months, drawn by something he could not adequately explain to anyone, least of all himself, something in the quiet dignity of her bearing, the intelligence visible in her careful observation, the grace with which she moved through a world that had decided she did not matter. The noise and heat of the ballroom pressed against Eleanor's careful composure, the laughter and music seeming suddenly unbearable, and she made her decision quietly, as she did most things, slipping from her post by the window toward the hallway that led to her brother-in-law's library, seeking the refuge she had learned to find in books and solitude, in spaces where she need not maintain the fiction that she did not mind being invisible. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The library welcomed Eleanor with its familiar quiet, the distant strains of the waltz muted by heavy oak doors and thick walls, transforming the ball's frantic energy into something dreamlike and remote. The room smelled of leather and beeswax, of old paper and the faint trace of pipe tobacco, scents that always calmed her with their promise of intellectual refuge. Mahogany shelves rose from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, their contents representing her brother-in-law's respectable, if unimaginative, collection, while the 4th wall held tall windows dressed in heavy green velvet curtains, now partially drawn against the night. Eleanor moved toward the poetry section with the ease of long familiarity, seeking the volume of Wordsworth that always soothed her spirits, her fingers trailing along leather spines as she counted along the shelf. She had just reached for the book, standing on her toes to grasp it from its position slightly beyond comfortable reach, when she heard voices in the hallway, male voices approaching with the particular cadence of private conversation. Panic fluttered in her chest at the prospect of being discovered here, of having to explain her retreat, of seeing pity or irritation in their faces at finding the spinster sister hiding among the books. Without conscious thought, she stepped backward, her grey silk skirts whispering against the window seat, and found herself suddenly behind the green curtain, pressed against the window frame in the narrow space between fabric and glass. Her heart hammered as the library door opened, as footsteps entered, as she realized with mortifying clarity that she was now trapped, unable to reveal herself without creating a scene far worse than simply being discovered reading. Through the heavy velvet she could make out shapes, shadows, 2 figures moving into the room, and she recognized the voice of Mr. Philip Langley, a gentleman she knew slightly from various gatherings, speaking with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself entirely alone with his companion. "For God's sake, Thomas," Philip was saying, "you cannot continue to deflect every inquiry about your marital intentions. You are 32 years old with an estate requiring an heir. Surely you can find someone suitable among this season's offerings." The other voice, deeper and quieter, belonged to Thomas Harcourt, and Eleanor felt a strange shiver run through her at the sound of it, though she could not have said why. She had observed him from a distance as she observed everyone, had noted his relative reserve among the more boisterous gentlemen, the way he seemed to listen more than he spoke, but they had never been introduced, had never exchanged a single word. "I have found someone," Thomas said, and something in his tone made Eleanor press harder against the window glass, made her breath catch in her throat. Philip laughed, the sound sharp with disbelief. "Then who is she, and why have you not declared yourself? Why this tedious secrecy?" There was a pause, the sound of liquid being poured, glasses touching, and then Thomas spoke again with a certainty that seemed to fill the library like a physical presence. "Eleanor Thornhill," Thomas said quietly, his voice deep and steady with a certainty that seemed to fill every corner of the library. "I would marry no one but Eleanor Thornhill." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs as her fingers clutched convulsively at the green velvet curtain, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what she had just heard. Surely she had misheard. Surely he could not mean her, not the overlooked spinster in dove-grey silk, not the woman society had long since dismissed as irrelevant. Philip's laugh rang out sharp with disbelief. "Eleanor Thornhill, you cannot be serious, Thomas. She must be 28 if she is a day, firmly on the shelf. And while I grant she seems pleasant enough in a quiet way, she is hardly the sort of woman a man of your standing would choose. Surely you could have any of a dozen younger beauties with better connections and considerably more charm." Eleanor felt each word like a knife twisting in her chest, confirming every cruel assessment she had ever made of herself, and she waited with sick dread for Thomas to laugh as well, to reveal this as the jest she knew it must be. Instead, his voice came again, harder now, edged with frustration. She is 28 years old and possesses more intelligence and grace than all those vapid beauties combined. I have watched her these past 3 months at every gathering. Have you never noticed the kindness with which she speaks to wallflowers and elderly guests whom everyone else ignores? The genuine interest she shows in their tedious stories? The way her eyes light with wit when she thinks no one is observing? There was the sound of footsteps, pacing perhaps, and Thomas continued with growing passion. She has the most remarkable eyes, Philip, grey-green like the sea in winter, and when she smiles, which is rare enough, it transforms her entire countenance. She reads poetry and philosophy. I have seen the books she selects from her brother-in-law's library. She thinks deeply about the world rather than merely existing on its surface, concerned only with fashion and gossip. Philip sputtered a response, but Thomas overrode him. I am tired beyond measure of this society that values nothing but youth and conventional beauty, that discards women of worth simply because they have reached an arbitrary age. Eleanor Thornhill has more substance in her smallest finger than Miss Louisa Whitmore possesses in her entire decorative person, and I will court her properly and marry her if she will have me, regardless of what gossips like Mrs. Pembroke choose to say about it. Eleanor's heart hammered so violently she feared they must hear it through the curtain, her whole body trembling as she pressed against the window glass, the cool pains doing nothing to calm the fever that seemed to consume her. This could not be real. Men like Thomas Harcourt did not notice women like her, did not see past the plainness to whatever qualities he claimed to admire. Surely this was some elaborate cruelty she could not yet comprehend. Philip's voice came doubtful and concerned. If you are certain, Thomas, though I confess I cannot fathom it, but you risk becoming a laughing-stock. You know that? And Thomas replied with finality, I am certain. I have never been more certain of anything. Now let us return to this tedious ball before we are missed. I have a courtship to plan. Their footsteps moved toward the door. It opened and closed, and Eleanor stood frozen behind the green curtain, her legs weak beneath her, her mind spinning with confusion and disbelief, and something that might have been hope if she dared allow herself to feel it. But she had learned long ago that hope was the most dangerous indulgence a woman in her position could permit, and so she remained hidden, clutching the curtain, trying to convince herself she had imagined the entire impossible conversation. Eleanor remained behind the green curtain for several minutes after the library door closed, her legs trembling so violently she feared they would not support her weight, her mind replaying Thomas Harcourt's words in an endless loop that made no more sense with repetition than they had upon first hearing. Surely she had misunderstood. Surely there was some explanation that would make this strange declaration reasonable and impersonal rather than the impossible thing it seemed to be. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to smooth the dove-grey silk of her skirts with shaking hands, to compose her features into the serene mask she had perfected over years of social invisibility before she finally emerged from her hiding place and made her way back toward the ballroom on unsteady feet. The noise and heat struck her like a physical blow after the library's quiet sanctuary. The waltz had given way to a livelier country dance, and the room seemed somehow both exactly as she had left it, and utterly transformed, as though she were seeing it through new eyes that could not quite focus properly on familiar scenes. She moved instinctively toward her usual station near the windows where the wallflowers congregated, but before she reached that safe haven, her eyes found him, almost against her will. Thomas Harcourt stood near the refreshment table in conversation with an older gentleman. His dark evening clothes elegant without ostentation, his posture erect but not stiff, and even from across the crowded room she could see the intelligence in his eyes as he listened to his companion's words. Had he always looked thus? Had she simply never truly observed him before? Or had his overheard declaration cast some spell that made her notice what had been invisible to her as she had been invisible to so many? As if sensing her regard, he glanced up, and their eyes met for the first time with her full awareness. Those grey-green eyes he claimed to admire, meeting his darker gaze across the expanse of polished floor and swirling dancers. And she saw something shift in his expression, a subtle softening around his mouth, an intensity in his attention that made her breath catch. He excused himself from his conversation partner and began to move toward her with clear purpose, weaving through the clusters of guests with easy grace, and Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as panic and hope warred within her chest. What would she say to him? How could she possibly speak to him, knowing what she now knew, without revealing that knowledge? But before he could reach her side, Miss Louisa Whitmore materialized, as if conjured by Eleanor's doubts, the golden-haired beauty in her fashionable white silk gown, intercepting Thomas with a brilliant smile and a flutter of her fan. And Eleanor watched as propriety demanded he pause, as Louisa laid one delicate hand on his sleeve and engaged him in conversation that seemed designed to captivate. Eleanor's brief moment of impossible hope crumbled like sand. Of course, this had been jest or delusion. Look at Louisa with her youth and beauty and charm. Look at the ease with which she commanded Thomas's attention while Eleanor stood forgotten by the windows. This was the natural order of their world, and she had been foolish to imagine otherwise, even for the span of a few racing heartbeats. She turned away before she could see more, before the tears that suddenly burned behind her eyes could betray her, and found her sister Beatrice at her elbow, wearing an expression of unusual concern. "Are you quite well, Eleanor? You look rather flushed. Perhaps you should sit down." And Eleanor nodded mutely, allowing herself to be guided to a chair in the corner, grateful for any excuse to hide her confusion and the treacherous hope she could not quite extinguish, despite every rational argument against it. Eleanor had not slept the night after Lady Somerset's ball. She had lain awake in her small bedroom in the Somerset townhouse, replaying Thomas Harcourt's impossible words until they lost all meaning and became mere sounds without sense. And by the time pale dawn light crept through her curtains, she had convinced herself with the cold logic of morning that she had misunderstood, or that he had been speaking in jest, or perhaps making some philosophical point to Philip Langley that had nothing to do with actual courtship intentions. She dressed in a simple pale blue morning gown, with none of the care she might have taken had she believed anything would come of yesterday's overheard conversation, and she spent the morning hours helping Beatrice respond to correspondence and reviewing household accounts, grateful for mundane tasks that kept her treacherous mind from wandering back to grey-green eyes and words about intelligence and grace that surely had not meant what they seemed to mean. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, as was typical for calling hours when few visitors bothered to pay attention to the Somerset residents, unless some particular social obligation demanded it. And Eleanor sat in the drawing-room with her embroidery making uneven stitches, while Beatrice read from the morning papers and commented on various society notices with the detached interest of one whose own position was secure. When the butler appeared in the doorway at precisely 3 o'clock with his silver tray bearing a single calling card, Eleanor glanced up without interest, expecting some tedious acquaintance of her brother-in-law, but Beatrice's sharp intake of breath made her look again, and she saw her sister staring at the card with an expression of absolute astonishment before Beatrice said in a voice gone suddenly strange, "It is Mr. Thomas Harcourt. He asks if he might pay his respects to Miss Eleanor Thornhill specifically." The embroidery hoop fell from Eleanor's nerveless fingers to the carpet as her heart began that same wild hammering it had achieved behind the library curtain. This could not be happening. This was not real. And yet Beatrice was already instructing the butler to show Mr. Harcourt in, was already turning to Eleanor with wide eyes and a dozen unspoken questions written clearly on her face. Eleanor had no time to compose herself, no time to prepare any defense against whatever cruel game this must surely be, before Thomas Harcourt entered the drawing-room, looking perfectly composed in his afternoon coat and breeches, his dark hair neatly arranged, his expression formal but with something warm in his eyes, as his gaze found Eleanor and held there for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the bounds of normal time. He bowed to Beatrice with perfect propriety. "Lady Somerset, thank you for receiving me." And then he turned to Eleanor and bowed again. "Miss Thornhill, I hope I find you well this afternoon." And his voice was exactly as she remembered from the library, deep and steady and somehow intimate, despite the formality of his words. Eleanor rose on shaking legs and managed a curtsy, though she could not, for her life, find her voice. While beside her, Beatrice recovered enough to gesture toward the chairs and offer refreshment with the automatic grace of years of social training, though her confusion was palpable in every movement. Thomas settled into the chair across from Eleanor with easy confidence and began to speak of ordinary things, the fine spring weather, the crowds at last night's ball, some recent political development she could not focus on properly, because her entire being was concentrated on the impossible fact of his presence here, in this drawing-room, looking at her as though she mattered, as though yesterday's overheard declaration had been real and true, and meant for action rather than mere philosophical speculation. And Eleanor felt her carefully constructed skepticism begin to crack under the weight of his steady attention and the genuine interest in his grey eyes, when he asked her opinion on some matter she barely comprehended. Eleanor found her voice at last when Thomas asked whether she had read the recent translation of Goethe's work that had been circulating among London's more literary circles, and she heard herself responding with more animation than she had intended. "Yes, I have read it and found the translation somewhat lacking in capturing the nuances of the original German, though I suppose any translation must lose something in the crossing from one language to another," and she saw surprise flicker across his features, followed by unmistakable interest as he leaned forward slightly in his chair and said, "You read German then, Miss Thornhill? I had not realized you were accomplished in languages." And the genuine curiosity in his tone loosened something tight in her chest, so that she found herself explaining how her father had believed in education for both his daughters. Though Beatrice had found languages tedious, while Eleanor had discovered in them a kind of freedom, a window into other worlds and ways of thinking. Thomas listened with an attention so complete it was almost disconcerting, his grey eyes never leaving her face, and when she paused, uncertain whether she had said too much, he began to speak of his own love of literature and philosophy, of the isolation he had felt at university surrounded by young men who cared only for sport and drinking while he had wanted to discuss ideas and meaning, and Eleanor felt the strangest sensation as though she were seeing herself reflected in another person for the first time in her life. Another soul who had felt the particular loneliness of being interested in things the world deemed unimportant or unfashionable. They spoke of books, and she forgot to guard her words, forgot to make herself small and unremarkable, and instead found herself debating with him the merits of Milton's later work compared to his earlier poetry, arguing her position with the eloquence she usually suppressed. And when he smiled at something, she said about Paradise Regained being the more mature work she felt. Warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sunlight streaming through the drawing-room windows. Beatrice sat forgotten in her chair by the fireplace, her embroidery lying idle in her lap as she watched this exchange with an expression Eleanor could not quite interpret, something between astonishment and cautious hope. And when the clock on the mantel chimed the quarter hour marking 20 minutes since Thomas's arrival, he glanced at it with obvious reluctance before rising to take his leave, as propriety demanded. He bowed to Beatrice and thanked her for her hospitality, then turned to Eleanor and said with careful formality that barely concealed something warmer beneath, "Miss Thornhill, I wonder if I might have permission to call again, perhaps tomorrow afternoon, if that would be convenient. I find I have much enjoyed our conversation and would welcome the opportunity to continue it," and Eleanor managed to nod her agreement, though her voice had fled again under the intensity of his regard and the impossible reality of Thomas Harcourt asking permission to see her again, actually requesting another meeting, as though her company held value worth seeking. Thomas called every afternoon for the next 1 days without fail, and with each visit Eleanor felt her skepticism give way by small degrees to something more dangerous, a cautious hope that perhaps what she had overheard in the library had been genuine after all. And by the morning of April 20th, when he sent a note requesting permission to take her for a promenade in Hyde Park that afternoon, she found herself actually caring about her appearance in a way she had not allowed herself to care in years. Beatrice had insisted on lending her a rose-colored walking dress of fine muslin with delicate embroidery at the hem, far finer than anything Eleanor owned herself, and as her lady's maid arranged her hair with more attention than usual, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection, and thought perhaps she did not look entirely hopeless. Perhaps there was something in her eyes that made Thomas Harcourt call day after day with that steady attention that never wavered. He arrived at precisely 4 o'clock, driving a fine curricle with matched bays, and he handed her up with such care, his grey eyes warm as they met hers, that Eleanor felt her heart lift with something close to happiness as they set off toward the park through streets busy with afternoon traffic and golden with the late April sun that had finally burned through the morning's clouds. Hyde Park was crowded with the fashionable world taking advantage of the mild spring weather, and everywhere Eleanor looked, she saw cherry blossoms drifting like snow from the trees lining the pathways, coating the ground in pale pink petals that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. And for a few minutes she let herself simply enjoy the beauty of the day and the solid warmth of Thomas's arm under her gloved hand as they joined the stream of elegant couples and families promenading along the main avenue. But it did not take long before Eleanor became aware of the stares following their progress, the heads turning as they passed, the whispers that were not quite quiet enough to be inaudible, and when they walked past a group of society matrons gathered near the Serpentine, she heard Mrs. Carr, Charlotte Pembroke's carrying voice, say quite clearly, "Well, I never thought to see Thomas Harcourt reduced to such desperation. Surely there must be some young lady of appropriate age and appearance if he is truly determined to marry." And another voice responded with barely suppressed laughter. "Perhaps it is a wager. You know how these gentlemen amuse themselves. I give it a fortnight before he drops the pretense." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face and her steps faltered, all the joy of the afternoon turning to ash in her mouth, as those casually cruel words confirmed every doubt she had been trying to suppress, every fear that this was too good to be true, too impossible to be genuine, and she felt Thomas's arm tense beneath her hand, felt him glance down at her with sudden sharp attention as though he had heard what she heard, and could read in her face exactly what damage those words had done. They walked on in silence for several minutes while Eleanor tried to compose herself and failed, tried to think of some graceful way to end this charade before she was hurt any worse. And finally, as they reached a quieter section of the path away from the main crowds, Thomas stopped and turned to face her directly, his expression serious and his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she found she could not. "Miss Thornhill," Thomas said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Eleanor's eyes sting with unshed tears, something urgent and raw that she had not heard from him before. "I must ask you directly whether you doubt the sincerity of my attentions," and Eleanor found she could not meet his gaze, as she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Mr. Harcourt, you must know that I am sensible of the great honour you do me by your visits, but I cannot help but think that perhaps you have been too kind, that perhaps out of some misguided sense of charity or some other motivation, I cannot fathom you have undertaken a course that must ultimately bring you regret and embarrassment, and I would release you from any obligation you may feel. I would not have you continue this if it is born of anything other than genuine regard, because I could not bear. I could not. Her voice broke, and she stopped speaking, horrified to feel tears threatening to spill over, and when Thomas took her elbow and guided her firmly off the main path to a secluded bench half hidden by flowering shrubs, she let him lead her because she had no strength left to resist, no defences remaining against the weight of Mrs. Pembroke's cruel words and all the doubts they had awakened. They sat, and Thomas turned to face her fully, his grey eyes intense and his jaw tight with barely controlled emotion as he said, "Eleanor," and the use of her Christian name shocked her into looking at him, "I am going to tell you something I had not intended to reveal quite so soon, but I see now that you will not believe me without complete honesty. I overheard what Mrs. Pembroke said, and I heard also what the other woman implied about wages and pretence, and I tell you now that every word was poison and lies." He leaned forward, and his hand moved as though he would take hers, but propriety held him back by the barest margin, leaving his fingers hovering near hers on the bench between them, as he continued, "I began calling on you because I have admired you from a distance for 2 years. Since the first evening I saw you at a musicale standing alone by the window while everyone else chattered about nothing, and I watched you listening to the music with such complete attention, such genuine appreciation, that I knew you were different from every other woman in that room, and in every room since I have seen you, and wished for the courage to approach you and tell you that your mind, your kindness, your grace are worth more than all the youth and beauty that society prizes so highly." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as Thomas's voice grew more passionate, felt something crack open in her chest as he said, "I do not ask you to trust me blindly, but I beg you to give me time to prove myself, to show you through my constancy and my devotion that what I feel is real and lasting, and I swear to you on my honour that this is no game, no wager, no charity, but simply a man who has found the one woman in all of England he wishes to know, to truly know, and perhaps, if she will permit it, to love." The 14 days that followed were a revelation to Eleanor, for Thomas called without fail each afternoon, and the pattern of their conversations deepened from cautious exchanges about books and music into something far more intimate, a genuine meeting of minds and hearts that Eleanor had never imagined possible, and by the evening of May 4th, when Beatrice arranged a private dinner party at the Somerset residence, with Thomas and Philip Langley among the carefully selected guests, Eleanor found herself actually looking forward to the evening, rather than dreading it as she once would have done. She wore a gown of deep green silk that Beatrice had insisted upon, a colour that brought out the hazel in her eyes that Thomas had once mentioned admiring, and when he arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, and his gaze found her across the drawing-room, she saw something kindle in his grey eyes that made her breath catch, a warmth and appreciation that still astonished her even after 2 weeks of his devoted attention. The dinner itself passed in a pleasant blur of conversation, with Beatrice's husband, Lord Somerset, holding forth on political matters, and Philip Langley entertaining the table with anecdotes from his travels. But Eleanor was most aware of Thomas seated across from her, of the way his eyes returned to her face again and again, of how when she ventured an opinion on the Catholic question, he leaned forward with genuine interest and asked her to elaborate, treating her thoughts with a respect that made her feel for the first time in her life that her mind was not merely tolerated, but truly valued. After dinner, when the gentlemen rejoined the ladies in the drawing-room rather than lingering over port, a breach of custom that Beatrice noted with raised eyebrows, Thomas came directly to Eleanor's side and said quietly that he had been counting the minutes until he could speak with her again. And something in the intimacy of his tone, the way he spoke as though they were alone despite the others present, made Eleanor feel a dangerous hope unfurling in her chest. They found themselves in a corner near the window where the spring evening was fading into dusk, the candlelight casting soft shadows across Thomas's face as he said, "I have been thinking about something you said last week, about how you felt invisible at social gatherings, as though you were watching life happen to other people, but never truly part of it yourself. And Eleanor, I must tell you that I understand that feeling more than you might imagine, because despite all the attention society has paid me, the invitations and the matchmaking mothers and the general assumption that I must be seeking a wife, I have felt utterly alone, surrounded by people who see only my estate and my income, and never once wonder what I might think or feel or hope for." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice, at the loneliness she heard beneath his words, and she said softly, "I think perhaps that is why we recognize each other, Thomas, because we have both been seen for everything except what we truly are." And he smiled at her then with such warmth that she felt something shift definitively in her heart, felt the last of her defenses crumble as he said, "Eleanor Thornhill, you are the first person in a very long time who has made me feel truly known, and I find I do not wish to go back to that loneliness now that I have found someone who understands." The invitation had arrived 3 days after that transformative evening at the Somerset residence, delivered in Thomas's own hand rather than sent by servant, and when Eleanor unfolded the heavy cream paper she found not a formal card, but a letter in his distinctive script asking if she would do him the honour of visiting Harcourt Manor in the countryside so that she might see his home and meet the people who depended upon him. For he wrote he could not properly court her without showing her the life he hoped they might one day share. And the intimacy of that hope expressed so directly made Eleanor's hands tremble as she read. Now, on the morning of May 11th, she sat beside Beatrice in the Somerset carriage as it rolled through the spring countryside, leaving behind the smoke and crowds of London for fields that blazed with new growth and hedgerows white with hawthorn blossom. And Eleanor found herself smoothing the skirt of her pale yellow travelling dress again and again, until Beatrice reached over and stilled her hands with a knowing smile and said, "He would not invite you to his home if his intentions were not serious, Eleanor. You must know that." And Eleanor nodded, but could not quite calm the flutter of nerves and anticipation in her chest. Thomas had ridden ahead on horseback an hour earlier, after meeting them at the coaching inn, where they had stopped to change horses, and Eleanor had watched him canter away with easy grace, and felt a strange, possessive pride that this man, this good and honourable man, had chosen to court her when he might have had his pick of any woman in London. The landscape grew more beautiful as they travelled deeper into the countryside. Rolling hills giving way to parkland, where sheep grazed beneath massive oak trees, and then the carriage turned through a pair of stone gates topped with carved falcons, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Harcourt Manor, rising at the end of a long drive lined with lime trees. The house was not one of the immense palatial estates that dominated the countryside, but rather a gracious manor of golden stone with mullioned windows that caught the midday sun and climbing roses already beginning to bloom around the entrance, and something about its proportions, its sense of being a true home rather than merely a display of wealth, made Eleanor's throat tighten with emotion. As the carriage drew to a halt, Thomas appeared at the top of the steps, flanked by what appeared to be his entire household staff, assembled to greet them. And when he handed Eleanor down from the carriage himself, rather than leaving it to a footman, she saw in his eyes an anxious hope that told her this moment mattered to him as much as it did to her. The housekeeper, a dignified woman of perhaps 60 years with kind eyes, curtsied and welcomed Eleanor as though she were already mistress of the house, and the other servants followed suit with such genuine warmth that Eleanor realized Thomas must have spoken of her to them, must have prepared them for her arrival in a way that suggested she was not merely a casual visitor, but someone of significance. After a light luncheon where Beatrice tactfully suggested she might rest in her rooms while Eleanor and Thomas took a turn about the gardens, Eleanor found herself alone with Thomas for the first time since arriving at Harcourt Manor. And as they stepped out through the French doors onto the terrace, the afternoon sun bathed everything in golden light that seemed to make the world glow with possibility. He offered her his arm and she took it, feeling the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his coat, and they descended the stone steps into gardens that stretched before them in a vision of beauty that took her breath away, formal parterres giving way to wilder plantings, and beyond them what appeared to be a rose garden in the first flush of bloom. As they walked, Thomas said quietly, "My mother planted these gardens. She had a particular love for roses, and spent hours here in the last years of her life." And Eleanor heard in his voice a grief that had softened with time, but never entirely faded, and she said gently, "How long has she been gone?" And he answered, 7 years this winter, and I confess there are days when I walk here and still expect to see her kneeling by the flower beds, with her hands in the soil and her face turned up to the sun." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the love in his voice, and she said, "She must have been remarkable to have raised such a son." And Thomas looked at her with surprise and gratitude, and said, "She was the only person who ever truly knew me, Eleanor, who saw past what the world expected me to be and loved me for what I was, and since she died, I have been so very alone in ways that I think few people understand." They had reached the rose garden now, and Eleanor could smell the heavy perfume of the blooms, mostly white roses that tumbled over arches and climbed the stone walls, and she said softly, "I understand, Thomas. I have been alone in that way my entire life, not for lack of family, but for lack of anyone who truly saw me as anything more than the pitiable spinster sister, a burden to be housed and fed but never truly valued." And she was startled by her own honesty, by how easily the truth spilled from her in this beautiful place, with this man who somehow made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his grey eyes intent on hers, and he said, "That is what drew me to you, Eleanor. Even before we ever spoke, I watched you at gatherings and saw how you noticed everything, how kind you were to those even more overlooked than yourself, how you bore society's dismissal with such quiet dignity. And I thought, here is a woman of substance, a woman worth knowing, and I have not been wrong." Eleanor felt her heart hammering in her chest as he led her deeper into the rose garden to where a stone arbor covered in climbing white roses sheltered a weathered bench. And when they sat together in that secluded spot, his hand found hers and held it gently, the first real touch between them, and Eleanor thought she might faint from the joy and terror of this moment that felt poised on the edge of something irrevocable and precious beyond measure. Thomas sat beside her on the weathered stone bench, surrounded by the sweet perfume of white roses, and Eleanor felt the weight of this moment pressing down on her chest like something physical, making it difficult to breathe as his hands held hers with such gentleness and certainty. And when he spoke, his voice was low and earnest, and she heard in it a tremor of vulnerability that told her he too understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Eleanor," he said, "I have rehearsed this moment 100 times in my mind since the first evening I truly saw you standing by the window at Lady Pemberton's musicale 2 years ago, watching everyone else with such keen observation and kindness in your eyes. And yet now that the moment is here, I find all my careful words inadequate to express what I feel." He paused and seemed to gather himself, and Eleanor's heart hammered so violently she was certain he must feel it through her hands, and he continued, Society has dismissed you as unworthy of notice because you are not 18 and simpering, because you have a mind that thinks rather than merely ornaments a pretty face, because you possess substance and depth that shallow people cannot recognize or value. But Eleanor, though I have watched you for so long, and I have seen what they are too blind to see. She felt tears beginning to slip down her cheeks as he spoke, and he lifted one hand to brush them away with his thumb, his touch so tender it made her want to weep harder. And he said, "I have seen your intelligence and wit, the way you notice everything, and understand the unspoken currents in every room. I have seen your kindness to those even more overlooked than yourself, the way you made conversation with the stammering Ashford boy at the Pembroke ball when everyone else mocked him. I have seen your courage in bearing society's cruelty with dignity when you had every right to rage against their injustice." Thomas shifted closer on the bench, and now both his hands cupped her face gently, forcing her to meet his eyes, which blazed with an intensity that stole her breath. And he said, "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Eleanor and I have loved you in silence for so long that remaining silent any longer has become unbearable, and I am asking you now to do me the very great honor of becoming my wife, of sharing my life and my home, and allowing me the privilege of spending the rest of my days proving to you that you are worthy of every happiness." Eleanor could not stop the sob that escaped her throat, and she said through her tears, "I heard you, Thomas. That first night at Beatrice's ball, I was hiding behind the library curtain when you told Philip you would marry no one but me, and I thought it must be mockery or madness, because why would you want me? But you have been so patient and kind, and I have been so afraid to believe this was real." Thomas made a sound that was half laugh and half something closer to a sob himself, and he said, "Then you knew even before I properly courted you. Oh, Eleanor, all this time you have been testing my sincerity, and I did not understand why you seemed so wary. But I am glad you heard, because now you know this is no sudden fancy, but a love that has been growing in me for years." She reached up and touched his face wonderingly, feeling the slight roughness of his jaw, and she whispered, "Yes, Thomas, yes, I will marry you." And as she spoke, he pulled a ring from his waistcoat pocket, an emerald set in gold that gleamed in the late afternoon light, and he slipped it onto her finger, saying, "This was my mother's, and she would have loved you as I do, for she too valued substance over superficiality, and she taught me to see what truly matters in a person." And Eleanor looked at the ring through her tears and thought she had never seen anything so beautiful in her life. For a long moment after Eleanor whispered yes, they simply sat together on the stone bench beneath the white roses, with his mother's emerald ring gleaming on her finger and the late afternoon sun casting everything in gold. And then Thomas drew her to her feet and pulled her into his arms with a tenderness that made her feel both infinitely precious and entirely safe. And Eleanor, who had spent 28 years believing herself unworthy of such an embrace, felt something deep within her chest crack open and flood with warmth as she rested her head against his shoulder and felt his heart beating steady and strong beneath her cheek. "Thomas," she whispered, and he said, "Eleanor," and the simple exchange of their Christian names felt like a claim and a promise, an intimacy that marked the shift from courtship to something deeper and more permanent. And when he tilted her chin up gently with his fingers and looked into her eyes with such love that it stole her breath, she thought she had never imagined anyone could look at her this way, as though she were beautiful and valuable and utterly cherished. He bent his head slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, but Eleanor rose on her toes to meet him, and when their lips touched, it was gentle and sweet and chaste as propriety demanded. But beneath the gentleness, she felt the barely restrained intensity of his feeling for her, and knew that he had waited so long and wanted so much. And when they finally drew apart, she was trembling, and he steadied her with his hands on her shoulders and said with a shaky laugh, "I have imagined this moment for 2 years, Eleanor, and the reality is more wonderful than any fantasy could be." She looked down at the ring on her finger, turning her hand to catch the light, and said wonderingly, "I still cannot quite believe this is happening, that you chose me of all the women you might have had." And Thomas took her hand and raised it to his lips and kissed her fingers just above where the emerald gleamed and said, "You speak as though you were my second choice or a consolation prize, when the truth is there has never been anyone else, Eleanor, from the moment I first truly saw you at that musicale 2 years ago. Every other woman has seemed pale and insubstantial by comparison, and I count myself the most fortunate man in England that you have agreed to be my wife." They walked slowly back through the rose garden as the sun sank lower and the shadows lengthened, and Thomas kept his arm around her waist in a possessive protectiveness that would have been scandalous before their engagement, but now was perfectly proper, and Eleanor leaned into him, thinking how strange and marvelous it was that just 1 month ago she had been invisible and resigned to permanent spinsterhood, and now she was engaged to a man who loved her truly and saw her fully and wanted to spend his life with her. When they reached the terrace, Thomas said, "We should tell Beatrice and make plans to return to London tomorrow, so we might announce our engagement properly." And though Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of facing society as his betrothed, she looked at his strong profile in the fading light and felt certainty settle over her that whatever gossip and cruelty awaited them in London, she could bear it because she would not be facing it alone. And she said, "Yes, let us return tomorrow and face them all together." And Thomas squeezed her hand and led her inside to share their joy with her sister and begin planning the life they would build together. The Somerset ballroom blazed with candlelight on the evening of May 14th, and Eleanor stood at the top of the marble staircase with Thomas beside her, and his hand warm and steady at the small of her back, and she could see the sea of upturned faces below gazing up at them with expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to barely concealed malice. And she felt her courage waver for just a moment before Thomas leaned close and whispered, so only she could hear, "You are the most beautiful woman in this room. Eleanor and I am the proudest man in England." And his words steadied her enough that she lifted her chin and allowed him to guide her down the stairs into the glittering crowd that parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. Beatrice had outdone herself in planning this announcement ball, and the ballroom was festooned with white roses that reminded Eleanor of the garden at Harcourt Manor, where Thomas had proposed just 3 days earlier. And as they reached the bottom of the stairs, Eleanor heard the whispers beginning to ripple through the assembly like wind through wheat, shocked exclamations barely concealed behind fans and gloved hands. Mrs. Pembroke stood near the refreshment table resplendent in purple silk, and Eleanor watched as the older woman's face cycled through surprise and disapproval and finally settled into an expression of calculated interest. And Thomas must have noticed too, because his hand tightened protectively on Eleanor's waist as they moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations that ranged from genuine warmth to thinly veiled incredulity. Miss Louisa Whitmore approached with her mother, and the young beauty's perfect face showed naked confusion as she said in her crystalline voice, "Mr. Harcourt, I must confess myself utterly shocked by this news. I had not realized you were even acquainted with Miss Thornhill." And Thomas replied with a coolness that made Eleanor want to kiss him. "Miss Thornhill and I have been acquainted for several years, and I have admired her greatly for all that time, and I count myself fortunate beyond measure that she has agreed to be my wife." Philip Langley was there too, looking pleased and amused as he clapped Thomas on the shoulder and said, "I told you, Harcourt, that you were making the best decision of your life. Miss Thornhill is a remarkable woman, and I wish you both every happiness." And Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude toward Thomas's friend, who had witnessed his declaration in the library that first night, and had clearly come to accept what society still struggled to comprehend. The orchestra began playing a waltz, and Thomas turned to Eleanor and said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "My dear, may I have the honor of the first dance with my betrothed?" And Eleanor placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor, where they took position among the other couples. And as the music swelled and Thomas swept her into the turning figures of the dance, Eleanor felt every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them and heard the whispers rising to a crescendo of speculation and judgment. But then Thomas looked down at her with such open adoration that the crowded ballroom seemed to fade away, and there was only the two of them moving together in perfect harmony. And he said softly, "Let them talk, Eleanor. Let them whisper and wonder and criticize. None of it matters, because I have you and you have me, and our happiness does not require their approval or understanding." And Eleanor looked up into his face and felt the last remnants of her fear and doubt dissolve like morning mist. The waltz ended, and Thomas led Eleanor from the floor with his hand possessive at her waist, and they found themselves immediately surrounded by a cluster of society matrons led by Mrs. Pembroke, who smiled with all the warmth of winter frost and said in her carrying voice, "Miss Thornhill, I must say this is quite the unexpected match, and we are all simply astonished at Mr. Harcourt's choice. But then, I suppose there is no accounting for taste, and some gentlemen prefer a quieter sort of companion." And Eleanor felt the barb land precisely as intended, but before she could formulate any response, Thomas said with steel beneath his courteous tone, "Indeed, Mrs. Pembroke, I have always found that true gentlemen prefer intelligence and grace to mere superficial beauty, and I count myself fortunate that I possess the discernment to recognize genuine worth when others might foolishly overlook it." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut, and Eleanor watched Mrs. Pembroke's face flush with color as the older woman realized she had been subtly but unmistakably rebuked. And Philip Langley, who had been standing nearby, let out a barely suppressed laugh and said cheerfully, "Well spoken, Harcourt, and if I might add, Miss Thornhill, you look absolutely radiant this evening, and that emerald suits you perfectly." And Eleanor glanced down at the ring on her finger that caught the candlelight and glowed like green fire, and felt a rush of gratitude toward Philip for his consistent kindness. The evening continued with Thomas never leaving her side, and Eleanor noticed how his presence seemed to shield her from the worst of the gossip, though she could still feel the weight of judgment and speculation pressing in from all sides, and she found herself thinking how strange it was that just 5 weeks ago she had been invisible at these gatherings, and now she was the subject of every whispered conversation and speculative glance. Miss Louisa Whitmore drifted past on the arm of some young lord, and her beautiful face was marred by a pout of confused displeasure, as though she could not quite comprehend how the natural order of things had been so disrupted. And Eleanor felt a small, uncharitable flicker of satisfaction that the young beauty who had never known what it was to be overlooked was now experiencing the confusion of being passed over. As midnight approached and the ball began to wind down, Beatrice found them and embraced Eleanor with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I am so happy for you, sister. You deserve this joy more than anyone I know." And Eleanor clung to her sister and felt the complexity of their relationship in that moment, all the years of Beatrice's well-meaning pity and gentle condescension now transformed into genuine happiness, and perhaps even a touch of admiration that Eleanor had captured the attention of someone like Thomas Harcourt. When the last guests had departed and Thomas prepared to leave, he took both of Eleanor's hands in his and said softly, so only she could hear, "You were magnificent tonight, Eleanor. You held your head high and faced them all with such dignity and grace. and I have never been more proud to stand beside anyone." And Eleanor looked up into his face and said, "I could only do it because you were there, Thomas, because I knew that whatever they said or thought, I had your love and respect, and that was worth more than all their approval combined." Thomas departed the Somerset residence near 1 in the morning, and Eleanor stood at the window of her bedchamber, watching his carriage disappear into the London darkness, and she pressed her palm against the cool glass and felt the emerald ring solid and real on her finger, and thought how strange it was that just 32 days ago she had been hiding behind a curtain in the library, convinced that her life held no more surprises, and now everything had transformed in ways she could never have imagined possible. Sleep would not come despite her exhaustion, and she lay in her bed replaying every moment of the evening, the weight of society's judgment pressing against the joy of Thomas's unwavering devotion, and she found herself wondering how long it would take before the whispers died down, or if perhaps they never would, and she would spend the rest of her life as the woman who somehow inexplicably captured Thomas Harcourt. The thought brought a flutter of anxiety to her chest, but then she remembered the way he had looked at her on the dance floor, the way he had defended her to Mrs. Pembroke, and she felt the anxiety ease into something warmer and more solid. The next morning, Beatrice came to her room before breakfast with an armful of newspapers and fashion magazines, and her face was flushed with excitement as she said, "Eleanor, you must see this. The announcement has already appeared in the Morning Post, and there are mentions in 3 other papers. Everyone in London will know by noon." And Eleanor took the papers with trembling hands and read the formal words announcing the engagement of Mr. Thomas Harcourt of Harcourt Manor to Miss Eleanor Thornhill, and seeing it in print made it feel even more impossibly real. Beatrice settled onto the edge of the bed and took Eleanor's hand and said with unusual seriousness, "Sister, I must confess something to you. For years I have pitied you and thought your life so limited and small, and I am ashamed now to realize how wrong I was and how my pity must have wounded you. But watching you last night with Mr. Harcourt, I saw that you have found something far more valuable than I ever found in my own marriage. You have found a true partner who sees and values you completely." And Eleanor embraced her sister and felt tears rising at this unexpected confession and validation. The day passed in a whirlwind of visitors and congratulations, and by afternoon the drawing-room was filled with flowers sent from well-wishers, though Eleanor noticed that some of the cards bore messages that were more curious than congratulatory, and she could read between the polite lines the genuine confusion of people who could not comprehend why someone like Thomas would choose someone like her. Thomas arrived at the Somerset residence at 2 in the afternoon and found Eleanor in the morning room, surrounded by cards and letters and swatches of fabric for wedding preparations, and the sight of her bent-over correspondence with afternoon light gilding her hair made his heart constrict with fierce affection and protectiveness. And when she looked up and smiled at him, he thought again how blind society was to see her as anything but radiant. He had come with a specific purpose today beyond their usual visit, for he wanted to discuss the wedding date, and more importantly, he wanted to address the tension he had sensed in her these past 3 days since the announcement ball, the way she sometimes grew quiet and pensive as though listening to voices only she could hear, and he suspected those voices were the echoes of society's cruel whispers. Eleanor rose to greet him, and he took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles just above the emerald ring and said, "You look tired, my dear. Have you been sleeping?" And she gave a small laugh that did not quite reach her eyes and replied, "Well enough, Thomas. There is simply so much to organize, and Beatrice has been wonderfully helpful, but it is rather overwhelming." He drew her to the settee, and they sat close enough that propriety was stretched but not broken, and he said gently, Eleanor, I know you well enough now to recognize when something troubles you. Will you not tell me what weighs on your mind?" And she looked down at their joined hands and was silent for a long moment, before finally saying in a voice barely above a whisper, "Do you ever regret it, Thomas? Your choice of me, I mean, when you see how society reacts and hears what they say about us both?" His jaw tightened, and he felt anger rise, not at her, but at the small-minded cruelty that had planted such doubt in her heart. And he said with careful control, "Eleanor, look at me, please." And when she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "I have never regretted a single moment since the day I first called on you. In fact, my only regret is that I did not approach you sooner, and that I allowed society's foolish prejudices to make me hesitate even briefly. And as for what they say, I care nothing for the opinions of people too superficial to recognize true worth when it stands before them." She searched his face as though looking for any hint of insincerity, and he let her look, let her see everything he felt written plainly in his expression. And finally she said, "They think you must be mad or desperate or playing some elaborate jest. Mrs. Pembroke told Lady Ashworth that you must have suffered some head injury in the war that impaired your judgment," and despite the pain in her voice, there was also a thread of incredulous humor at the absurdity. Thomas felt his anger transform into something more productive, and he said, "Then let them think what they will. Eleanor, in 6 months or a year, when they see us happy together, their gossip will turn to other subjects, and they will forget they ever questioned us. But even if they never forget, I do not care, because my happiness is not dependent on their approval, and neither should yours be." And he lifted her hand to his chest and pressed it over his heart and said, "This is what matters. What is here and what is in your heart, everything else is just noise." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest at his words, and she allowed herself to lean slightly into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence and unwavering certainty. And she realized that this was what she had never had before. Someone who stood as a bulwark against the world's judgment, and who valued her enough to be that shelter. They sat in silence for several minutes, her hand still pressed to his chest where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. And finally she said, "You are right, Thomas. I know you are right. But it is difficult to silence voices I have been hearing my entire life, the ones that say I am not enough and never will be." And he nodded slowly and replied, "I know it is difficult, Eleanor, and I do not expect those voices to disappear overnight. But perhaps each day you might try to listen to my voice instead, the one telling you that you are everything I never dared hope to find." She looked up at him and saw such fierce devotion in his expression that it took her breath away, and she said with a tremulous smile, "Very well. Thomas, I shall try, though you must be patient with me when I falter." And he raised her hand to his lips again and said, "I have all the patience in the world for you, my dear. After all, I waited 32 years to find you so. A few more months or years to convince you of your own worth seems a small price to pay." The conversation turned then to more practical matters, and they discussed the wedding date, agreeing on the 15th of June, which would give them just over 4 weeks to complete preparations. And Eleanor felt a flutter of nervous excitement at the reality of it, that in 32 days she would be Miss Thomas Harcourt, and would leave London for Harcourt Manor and a life she had never imagined possible. Thomas told her he wanted a relatively small ceremony, immediate family and close friends only. For he had no desire to turn their wedding into a spectacle for society's entertainment, and Eleanor felt relief wash over her, for she had been dreading the thought of walking down the aisle past rows of judgmental faces. They discussed the guest list, and Eleanor was surprised to find it would number only about 40 people, including Beatrice and her husband, Philip Langley, a few of Thomas's relations from the countryside, and a small selection of their closest acquaintances, and Thomas said firmly, "I want our wedding to be a celebration, Eleanor, not a performance, and I want you to feel only joy that day, not anxiety about others' opinions." Beatrice entered the room then, carrying a tea tray, and her face brightened when she saw them sitting close together in easy intimacy, and she said, "I thought you might want refreshment. You have been talking for over an hour," and Eleanor realized with surprise that time had passed so quickly in Thomas's company that she had not noticed. Beatrice poured the tea with practiced grace and settled into the chair opposite them, and Eleanor noticed the way her sister's expression had softened over these past weeks from pity to something approaching admiration, as though seeing Eleanor through Thomas's eyes had altered her perception entirely. And Beatrice said, "I must confess, Thomas, I had my doubts when you first began calling. Not about your character, of course, but about whether Eleanor would allow herself to accept your regard. She has always been so certain of her own invisibility that I feared she would talk herself out of happiness." Thomas glanced at Eleanor with such tenderness that she felt warmth flood her cheeks, and he replied, "I confess, Lady Somerset, that your sister's conviction of her own unworthiness has been the greatest obstacle I have faced, far more challenging than society's gossip or any external disapproval. But I believe I am making progress in convincing her otherwise." And Eleanor said quietly, "You are, Thomas. Truly you are. It is only that habits of thought formed over 28 years do not disappear overnight." Beatrice handed them each a cup and said, "Well, I think it speaks well of you both that you are honest about these difficulties rather than pretending everything is effortless. Marriage requires work and understanding, and the fact that you are building that foundation now bodes well for your future." And Eleanor felt grateful for her sister's support, even as she remembered all the years when Beatrice had looked at her with sad resignation as though Eleanor's spinsterhood was an unfortunate but inevitable fact. The conversation turned to wedding preparations, and Beatrice proved invaluable in her knowledge of dressmakers and arrangements, suggesting that Eleanor visit Madame Dubois on Bond Street for her wedding dress, as she was the finest modiste in London and would create something that flattered Eleanor's figure and colouring, and Thomas said he would provide whatever funds were necessary, and that Eleanor should spare no expense in outfitting herself properly. Eleanor protested that she did not need elaborate expenditure, but Thomas insisted, saying, "Eleanor, you will be mistress of Harcourt Manor, and you must have a wardrobe befitting your position. Besides, I want you to have beautiful things, not out of vanity, but because you deserve to feel beautiful and valued." And she saw that this mattered to him deeply, that providing for her was part of how he expressed his regard. They discussed the guest list in more detail, and Beatrice offered to handle the invitations, and Thomas mentioned that his aunt and uncle from Derbyshire would arrive a week before the wedding and stay at his London residence, and Eleanor felt nervous about meeting his family, but he assured her they would love her as he did. Philip Langley was to serve as groomsman, and Beatrice would stand with Eleanor, and the ceremony would take place at St. George's in Hanover Square at 11 in the morning, followed by a wedding breakfast at the Somerset residence. And as these plans took concrete shape, Eleanor felt the reality of it settle over her like a warm cloak, that in just 32 days she would speak vows that would transform her entire existence. Thomas arrived early that evening to accompany Eleanor and Beatrice to the assembly rooms where the announcement ball would be held. And when Eleanor came down the stairs, his expression made her breath catch, for she saw such undisguised admiration in his eyes that she could no longer doubt his regard, and he said softly, "Eleanor, you look beautiful. The deep blue of your gown brings out the colour of your eyes perfectly," and she felt warmth flood her cheeks as Beatrice smiled approvingly from her position near the door. The carriage ride to the assembly rooms was brief, but Eleanor felt her nervousness increasing with each passing moment, for she knew that their formal announcement would unleash a torrent of gossip and speculation, and Thomas seemed to sense her anxiety, for he reached across the space between them and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm, in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive. When they entered the ballroom, Eleanor was immediately aware of the attention focused upon them, for word had spread through society that Thomas Harcourt was planning to make an important announcement, and speculation was running wild, with some saying he would announce his engagement to Louisa Whitmore, while others whispered that perhaps he had received some honour or recognition from the Crown. Eleanor saw Mrs. Pembroke standing near the refreshment table, surrounded by her usual circle of gossips, and the older woman's eyes widened when she saw Eleanor enter on Thomas's arm, wearing a gown that was clearly expensive and fashionable, a far cry from the modest dove-grey silk she had worn to Beatrice's ball just over 1 month ago. Thomas led Eleanor to the centre of the room, where a small platform had been erected for the announcement, and Philip Langley joined them there, along with Beatrice and her husband, and Eleanor felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. Thomas stepped forward, and the room fell silent, all eyes fixed upon him with avid curiosity, and he said in his deep, steady voice, "I have gathered you all here this evening to share news of great personal happiness. I have asked Miss Eleanor Thornhill to be my wife, and she has honoured me by accepting. We will be married on the 15th of June, and you are all invited to share in our joy." The silence that followed his words was profound, and Eleanor could feel the shock rippling through the assembled guests like a physical wave. And then the whispers began, low and incredulous, and she heard Mrs. Pembroke's voice rise above the others, saying, "Eleanor Thornhill, surely he cannot be serious. She is 28 years old and has been on the shelf for a decade." And Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but Thomas's hand tightened on hers, and he turned to look directly at Mrs. Pembroke with such cold disdain that the older woman actually stepped backward. Thomas said clearly, his voice carrying across the now silent room, "I am entirely serious, Mrs. Pembroke. Miss Thornhill is the most intelligent, accomplished, and kind woman of my acquaintance, and I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate that she has agreed to be my wife, and anyone who has spent more than 5 minutes in genuine conversation with her would understand why I have chosen her above all others."